What is psychology? Basic questions we're going to be looking at in this lecture. What is psychology? We'll come up with an answer to that question. What are the major research areas? What are the professional or applied specialties in psychology? And what were the first two major schools of thought in psychology? So, what is psychology? My assumption is that you have some presuppositions or some ideas about what psychology is. Let's look at the word itself. Is a combination of the two Greek words psyche and logos. Essentially, it translates into the logic of the soul. The soul was a term used to describe that thing within us that made us go, that animating force. You don't see it in the literature anymore, the psychological literature, but when you look at classical writings in psychology and the people that were interested in everything that had to do with being human, which really is what psychology is all about. You see the word soul referred to quite a bit. It was that descriptor, that word that described that animating force within us. So it's a combination of those two words. It's basically the study of the soul. It's a science and it's also a profession. So from a scientific standpoint, we study behavior, which is broadly defined, which includes emotions and thoughts, as well as the physiological and cognitive processes that underlie it. And it is also a profession that applies the accumulated knowledge of this science to practical problems. So there's people out there who are interested in leveraging knowledge and creating knowledge that is in service of solving real world problems. And there's those who are simply interested in finding out because they're curious and they're fascinated by some aspect of human behavior. All right, so psychology is both a science and a profession. So we'll look at these 9 major research areas. This doesn't exhaust the number of research areas in the field. There's all kinds of different people doing different things, but these are the big ones. So developmental psychology, social psychology, educational psychology, health psychology, physiological, experimental, cognitive, psychometrics, and personality. So we'll look at each one of these very briefly. So developmentalists are interested in lifespan development, that is how we change and in some cases stay the same over the course of our lifespan. That is from prenatally to sitting on your porch when you're in your 80s looking back over your life and sort of headed towards sort of the end of it all. So developmentalists are interested in that, how we change and how we stay the same over the course of our lives. And the social psychologists are interested in those real and imagined influences of others over how we think, feel, and behave. So, for example, a social psychologist might be interested in racial prejudice and those factors that might give rise to prejudicial sentiments in an individual. What are the environmental factors, those social situations that might trigger a racist sentiments and that sort of thing. Educational psychology has to do with, uh, for example, coming up with effective pedagogical or teaching strategies and how kids learn and adults learn as well. Health psychology is kind of what it sounds like. Those are people that are interested in psychological factors that underpin both physical and mental health. It's a rapidly growing area within this very vast and diversified discipline called psychology. The physiological folks are interested in the biological underpinnings of behavior. So everything that we think, feel, and do has some sort of biological substrate. So the physiological folks are interested in looking at human behavior, again, broadly defined from the biological level of analysis. The experimental psychologists, this is sort of I guess, a catch-all or semi-catch-all category. So there's people in experimental psychology and publishing in journals that fall within that category, doing work in behavior analysis, working largely with lab animals like rats and pigeons, and finding and studying animal and human behavior in very in laboratory environments and so forth. There's people that are studying the senses and our sensory apparatus, our visual systems and our auditory systems and that sort of thing. Um, and also there's people that are studying how a sensation informs perception, that is how we put that information that we're getting from our senses together The cognitive folks are interested in phenomena like memory and forgetting and problem solving and that sort of thing. More specifically, for example, somebody might be interested in studying how we learn to read and how we process textual information and some of the factors that might influence that process. Psychometrics has to do with tests and measures, so psychologists are interested in studying many different things, but some of those things, like intelligence or IQ, whatever you want to call it, cognitive ability is not directly observable. So we've got to come up with tests that tap into some of these unobservable constructs. They're called constructs because most people, including psychologists, agree that they exist and they're important, but we can't really clearly and objectively identify them. Like self-esteem is another one. There's people that come up with ways to measure self-esteem, and then once you get somebody's score on some self-esteem scale, you can correlate that with other important stuff like how well they do in school, how well they do in social situations, and that sort of thing. So the psychometricians are interested in coming up with reliable and valid tests and measures. And then lastly are the personality folks. Again, kind of what it sounds like. Personality psychologists are interested in looking at traits and attributes that we possess and how they relate to other traits and attributes and other important stuff that matters to us in life. Like how does somebody who is an extrovert versus somebody who's an introvert? An introvert is somebody who's more inward focused. An extrovert is somebody who's more outward focused. How do these people fare differently in the workplace, in other kinds of social situations, and so forth? So coming up with measures of personality traits and attributes, looking at individual differences and group differences, and that sort of thing, how they relate to important outcomes in life. So those are the 9 major ones. Again, doesn't exhaust the list. Lots of people doing different things. So a little bit about psychology as a profession. This is sort of the applied areas of psychology. People out there in the real world facing and trying to solve real world problems. So we've got the counseling, clinical, school, and industrial organizational psychologists. So counseling and clinical are similar. I would say the main difference is that counseling folks are primarily focused on helping people with so-called non-clinical issues, that is, issues that you can't be diagnosed with. So, for example, somebody might be dissatisfied with their life, somebody might be transitioning in their career, they might be having relationship problems. So you can't be diagnosed with a relationship problem, but certainly you could use some help every now and then. Most of us can use some help in these, I guess, non-pathological areas. So the counseling psychologist would be the one that would primarily focus on those sort of issues, whereas the clinician is more concerned with diagnosis and treatment of diagnosable psychological or psychiatric problems like depression and anxiety. There's tremendous overlap between counseling and clinical folks, but they're out there working with people to try to help them with their real world issues, whether they're diagnosable or not. The school psychologists are working in school settings primarily, working with kids and also with adults to optimize performance and guide students in their coursework and that sort of thing. Help them deal with possible conflicts that they're experiencing with peers and any number of different areas that concern the school setting. And then the industrial organizational folks, they're out there in the business world, largely in the corporate world, and industry and so forth, trying to help solve some of the problems faced in industry and in business. So, for example, personnel selection. How do you pick the best person for the job? If you own your own business or if you're working as a staff, it's very important that you hire somebody into a role that they're going to stand a pretty good chance of succeeding at. So how do you do that? It's really hard. So you want to try to rationalize that process and be thoughtful about it. So IO folks, the psychologists working out with industry, develop ways to do that, to um, make better assessments and better predictions about how somebody's going to do on the job based on certain tests and measures and interview processes and stuff like that. How do you keep people healthy on the job? How do you build morale on the job? There's so many problems, interesting problems that are being faced out there in the corporate and the business world every day that are really in need of solutions. So those are some of the applied areas and the research area. So here's a concept check, and I'll throw these concept checks into our lectures just to kind of get our minds working in a slightly different way. So which of the following areas is most likely to be classified as an applied area of specialization in psychology? A, B, C, or D? The correct answer is D, counseling psychologists. The other ones are the research areas. So here's a pie chart showing the distribution of PhDs in psychology and their occupational categories. So you can see that the majority are in colleges and universities and private practice. So that's the lion's share of those who hold the PhD in psychology. And again, there's people working in a lot of different areas, but most of them are in educational settings or in private practice. Sometimes people work in both areas. So you can have somebody who's a clinical psychologist who holds a professorship, but also is seeing people in private practice. So lots of people doing different things. I've provided a supplementary link to the American Psychological Association's website. The APA is a large professional organization that if you're a psychologist, you probably belong to the APA. But this has been around for, I think, over 100 years. But there's many different people these days doing many different things. And if you go to the APA website and look at the divisions menu item, you can browse through and you can see all the different groups of people that have over time gotten together and over a shared interest, and they have their annual meetings, they have journals that they publish within those particular divisions and that sort of thing. I believe there's over 50 of them now. So psychology today didn't start out this way, but today it is vigorous and diversified. Lots of people doing lots of different things. Really, psychology has everything to do with being human, so that covers a tremendous amount of ground. All right, so again, psychology just didn't appear one day. There's a really fascinating history of the development of really how we think about and how we try to explain human behavior. So we're just going to very briefly touch on a bit of the history of this discipline. I just wanted to say that there's lots of information online about the history of psychology. There's even places where you can get a PhD in the history of psychology, if that's what really interests you about this field. All right, so now for a very brief history. It goes back to antiquity. So this is back in the before the Common Era, back in the time of the ancient Greeks and Socrates and Aristotle and Plato and all those folks. So how did these folks explain human behavior? Certainly they were interested in why we do what we do. How do they do that? How do they explain it? Well, early knowledge of human behavior was arrived at through observation. This is careful observation, speculation, which is really thinking about what you've observed and then using logic and reason. So I'm going to have you pause this in a second. I'm going to read you a list of instructions, and then will you pause this? Actually, yeah, just pause it for a second and get a piece of paper. Now, all right, presumably you're back and you have a piece of paper. So I'm going to read you a set of instructions, and we can consider that what you're going to be doing is engaging in a bit of human behavior, and then we're going to try to explain it like the old philosophers did through observation, speculation, and reason. Okay? So your mission right now is to follow my instructions, You have a piece of paper in front of you. This is a regular size notebook paper or copy paper, whatever, 8.5 by 11. So, all right, so here we go. Here's the first instruction. Write your name in the upper right-hand corner. Instruction 2. Fold paper in half lengthwise, left over right. Instruction 3. Open it back up again. You should see a crease down the center. Instruction 4. Fold upper left corner down so that the top of the page lines up with the center crease. And you can pause this if you need more time to execute the instruction. All right, instruction 5, do the same with the right corner. Instruction 6, fold paper in half lengthwise, left over right. Instruction 7, fold the top flap lengthwise so that its right edge lines up with the left edge of the page. Eight, turn the paper over. 9, fold the top flap lengthwise so that the left edge lines up with the right edge of the page. All right, so presumably you've paused and turned this, possibly rewound this video a little bit, and so you have those instructions, which is the beauty of these video lectures, but you should have something in front of you that looks like a paper airplane if you followed those instructions correctly. So how do we explain that behavior? Well, you can observe the behavior, you can think about it, and you can use some logic. And if you did that, you might come up with this. And this looks mathematical somewhat, but it's not really. The B is behavior. We can think about behavior, whether it's following a set of instructions, like I just asked you to do, as being a function of a couple of different things, and that's captured in that equation. So behavior is a function of disposition and situation, interacting in complex ways. So disposition is what you bring to the situation, that is your personality, your mood, and so forth. And then the situation is just that. It's the conditions under which you're functioning. So the situation right now is that I'm the so-called authority figure. I've asked you to do several things, including getting a piece of paper and following instructions and so forth. So my guess is that I got 100% of you to comply with my request. So then really what's going on here is why did you go along with what I asked you to do? If you did, you probably did it in a somewhat automatic way. That is, you didn't really consider not going along with what I was asking you to do, but rather you just sort of reflexively went along with the program. And so the question really becomes, how come? And you can think of, as you move into other spaces or other situations that you populate during your day, how much of your behavior really is being elicited or evoked in a semi-automatic way, or otherwise, or how much of the behavior that you engage in, your thoughts and emotions and so forth, is being driven by a conscious, rational decision to sort of do what you do, versus being sort of automatically elicited or evoked. So these are important questions, because it really, I mean, this is sort of a trivial behavior, but what if you sort of go back historically and you look at sort of awful things that people have done to each other by complying or obeying the so-called requests or orders of an authority figure. So folding a paper is trivial. Think about other behaviors that we sort of do automatically without questioning that may, in some cases, harm other people. So if you forget everything that you learn in this class, remember this, that if you're trying to explain some little bit of behavior, like following a set of instructions, complying with your so-called authority figure, that's me, um, uh, know that it's more complicated than just some singular answer, rather that behavior is usually the result or the end result of this complex interaction of disposition and situation. There are situations historically, for example, Nazi Germany, where people kind of went along and did awful things to other human beings, and then found themselves, probably in many cases, after they had done what they'd done, wondering how is it that uh, I did that. And sometimes we find ourselves in those situations where our behavior, in hindsight, surprises even ourselves. It is There are some situations that are so powerful that it completely eclipses and overwhelms everything that we believe to be true about ourselves. Um, so, so we really need, even though that this partial explanation um, is it's a decent explanation, but it's a very general situation. There are those kind of events that we want a more fuller, a more systematic, a more rigorous investigation of, other than just that, so that we can come up with solid answers, so that we can possibly predict this kind of event, like Nazi Germany, and possibly prevent it from happening again. So we need more, essentially. That's what I'm getting at. We need more rigorous modes of investigation so we can come up with more reliable answers. So, um, the advent of the scientific revolution presented a solution to knowledge that was based on sort of mere observation or mere speculation, mere logic, but rather experimentation became sort of the path to knowledge. If we wanted reliable information, then we turn to the scientists. And so, somewhere in the early 1800s, uh, people uh, began doing experimental research in what would formerly had been considered the domain of philosophy. And then in 1879, the new experimental science of psychology was born, and displaced philosophy as sort of the path to knowledge about human behavior. So psychology really is the science, the only science that's specifically and exclusively focusing on trying to explain and understand um, and learn about human behavior. It's exclusively dedicated to that. So we're going to look at the first schools of thought, uh, and then we'll talk about this in lecture two, some more about this. So um, this is an introductory psychology class, and unlike most introductory classes, there's always these characters that sort of populate the story. So the father of this, the father of that. So psychology is really no different from these other introductory courses in this respect. So I want to introduce this gentleman, Wilhelm Wundt, as the father of experimental psychology. Wundt was a German physiologist, and he's known for establishing the first experimental psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. So if you want to know what the birth date of psychology is an experimental science, it is 1879, and its birthplace is Leipzig, Germany. So we can credit Wilhelm Wundt with really spearheading the development and also the growth of experimental psychology. That was his major contribution. He did work in a lot of different areas, in sensation and perception, and he also had his own brand of social psychology, Volcker psychology. That is, you don't really hear about it in the introductory psych text. You have to kind of find out a little bit more about Wundt. But Wundt was a great thinker and a real progenitor of psychology as an independent experimental science. So any new science faces a couple of tasks, a lot of tasks actually, but two of the most basic tasks are really defining what the subject matter of the new science is, and also how you're going to study it. So Wundt defined the subject matter of psychology as consciousness. So consciousness was what the psychologists were interested in studying. So what is consciousness? Well, we can just think of it as the awareness that we have of internal and external stimuli. So we're aware of our thoughts and feelings and so forth internally, but we're also aware of stuff going on outside of our bodies, sounds and things that we see and stuff like that. So how do you study this? Well, that was the second part of the second task of the new science. Well, Wundt came up with a rigorous method of introspection, and introspection really means just looking inward. So this was the careful, systematic observation of one's own conscious experience. So Wundt in his studies, largely in sensation and perception, trained graduate students in the procedures of introspection. So he would expose them to different physical stimuli like colors and so forth, and then he would have them sort of look inward and report what the experience of that color was, or maybe the experience of some sort of pain, blunt pain or sharp pain, and so forth. So Wundt's efforts would fall within the first major perspective in psychology, which was the structuralist or structuralism. His number one student was this gentleman, Edward Titchener. He was a British gentleman. He, along with Wundt, established this first perspective known as structuralism. And the basic question that the structuralists were interested in asking and answering was, what is consciousness made of? So part of this has to do with the early psychologists really trying to define themselves as a science among the other natural sciences. So, for example, physics and the physicists, how do they find out about matter? Well, they break it down they break matter down into its elementary particles and so forth. So the psychologists were thinking, well, maybe we could find out about conscious experience by kind of exposing people to different experiences and then having them introspect and sort of break it down into its essential elements, so we can really understand what this conscious experience is composed of. Excuse me. So structuralists and structuralism really focused on analyzing consciousness into its basic elements using introspection. Lots of studies in sensation and perception. So there were people being exposed systematically to different visual stimuli, auditory stimuli, tactile stimuli, and then they would introspect about the experience and then report out to the experimenter. And those reports, or those narratives of these research participants, became the data of the structuralists. So let's make this a little bit less abstract. So what I want you to do is pause this, and then you're going to go to the supplementary websites in this module 1, and click on the binaural beats, and you'll hear some binaural beats. And what I'd like you to do when you do this is to close your eyes and really kind of let yourself experience this auditory stimuli, and then I want you to try to describe it, write it down as if you're going to share your experience with somebody else. And what you're doing is you're doing essentially what Wundt and Titchener did in their labs, was to expose yourself to this stimulus and then try to articulate what that was like for you. So take a second and do that. All right, so you're back after experiencing the binaural beats. And one of the things that when I do this in class and face-to-face is I have people sort of share their experience and report out. And almost universally what I find is that there's variability in the experience. Some people like it, some people don't. Some people experience it one way, some people experience it another. So there's a tremendous amount of difference in how people experience presumably the same thing. So really, if you think about this as sort of an effort to really kind of nail down the fundamental experience, or the basic elements of the experience of binaural beats, it becomes kind of tricky. And this is the problem that the structuralists ran into. They exposed their research participants to certain stimuli, and then they would have people reporting quite different things. Certainly, the experience of something can be multifaceted, um, but really what you end up with is a whole bunch of different perspectives on the same thing, and they call this stimulus error. So you really can't do a whole lot when your subjects or your participants are reporting all kinds of different things. You can't really nail down the essence of the thing, so to speak. Like a physicist can bust a piece of matter down into its elementary particles, and there you go. Uh, Molecules and atoms and that sort of thing. But the psychologists really couldn't nail it down, the structuralists. So that was a problem with structuralism. Functionalism, and this was the American take on on experimental psychology. This was the second school of thought that was also concurrent um, with structuralism, which was primarily a European gig. We had William James at Harvard coming up with his own brand or his own perspective in psychology. James's thinking was strongly influenced by the work of Charles Darwin. Darwin published a very influential book in 1859 known as The Origin of the Species, where he laid out his theory of evolution and the notion that we are the way we are, humans and animals. He focused more on animals than in humans in his text, but we are the way we are because whatever characteristics, these physical and also mental attributes that we have, somehow helped us live long enough to reproduce, and then we've passed um, the traits and attributes that increased our reproductive success on to the next generation. And this really fascinated um, James in his thinking about mental attributes. So he established this school of thought known as functionalism, and his basic question was, what is consciousness good for? So this is in contrast to what the structuralists were looking at in terms of what consciousness is made of, breaking experience down into its elementary components. Rather, the functionalists were more interested in, okay, what are these different mental abilities and capacities good for? In other words, how does memory or imagination help us get along in the world, help us live long enough to reproduce, such that we possess these traits today? Somehow or another, these mental capabilities have helped us. So this is functionalism. So really, we needed to go beyond, and this is James, sensation and perception to focus on the acts and the functions of the mind as opposed to its contents. So this really opened up studies in different areas in mental activity, imagination and memory and feeling and judgment and so forth. Different areas were being different things were being studied in a different way. Actually, I take that back. James used and the functionalists used introspection to get at these different mental phenomenon, but they certainly were um, not being studied by the structuralists with a view to really figuring out what good are they, what function do they serve us as a species. I want to say now that these days, currently, there's nobody that considers themselves a structuralist. There's nobody that considers themselves a functionalist. These are the first two earliest and now gone. They've gone away. Perspectives in psychology. However, uh, they've left us with a couple of different things. The structuralists, we can say, really helped establish psychology as an independent science, separate and distinct from philosophy. Define the subject matter of psychology as consciousness. That was studied through introspection. The functionalists have a lasting legacy in that the focus on the the functions of consciousness led to the development of applied psychology, and also behaviorism, which is a school of thought that we'll talk about in the next video. So those are really the lasting legacies of structuralists and the functionalists. So what's next? In the next video lecture, we're going to look at the behavioral, the psychoanalytic, and the humanistic perspectives. We'll talk about those. You're going to read about the cognitive, biological, and evolutionary perspectives in the text. So there's a bit on each of those. We're not going to talk about them in the lecture just to keep these lectures of reasonable length. I always wrap up the video lectures with learning objectives, and these map onto the ones that I give you in the overview of each module. So these are the learning objectives, and you can expect quiz and test questions to come from these, directly from these learning objectives. So as you prepare for your quizzes and so forth, be sure you focus on these learning objectives.